Hi, my name is Webb Mealy, also known on the internet as J. Webb Mealy. I'm a Bible scholar with a specialty in the book of Revelation and biblical eschatology. I'm going to be doing a presentation on 2 Corinthians 5, 1-9, and showing its background in some other biblical passages. To begin with, I'd like to talk about the context in Paul's life for the writing of this portion of 2 Corinthians. He writes this letter about in November or so of 56. In the spring of that year, he had been in Ephesus and had been planning to do a collection around Macedonia and Achaia, that is Greece and Macedonia, for the poor people in Judea. And he was planning to go on a trip to Jerusalem and bring the money with him as a contribution to the poor in the spring of 57. But in the spring of 56, the silversmiths in Ephesus, where he was staying and doing his gospel work, started realizing that if everyone in this area became Christians, that their work of making idols for the goddess Diana, the city that was like their patron goddess, that these silversmiths were going to lose business. And so they were angry and they stirred up the whole city and turned it into a giant mob and nearly killed Paul. Paul ended up leaving town under the threat of death with probably some people following him. And he crossed the Aegean Sea to Corinth, sort of fleeing from Ephesus. Now, he had intended to go to Corinth by a different method and at a different time. He had intended late in the year, around the time he's writing this, he had intended to be traveling from Ephesus overland all the way to Macedonia, and then around, kind of like counterclockwise around and down the Grecian peninsula to Corinth, and then back with all the money to go to Jerusalem. That was his original plan, but getting chased out of Corinth by a murderous mob, he ended up coming early to Corinth. But there he found that people were being influenced by some cynical people who had questions about his motives in collecting all this money, who claimed he wasn't a real apostle, and he was really confused by this and hurt by it, especially in the context of nearly getting killed. So he ended up leaving and going back to Troas, which is right on the west coast of Turkey, what they called in those days, they called it Asia. So he was right there in Troas for a while, and then he appears to have done a missionary trip with Timothy and another person to Illyricum, which is off to the northwest of Macedonia. But there, during the summer of 56, he ended up nearly losing his life again, seemingly being under extreme pressure and danger. And so when he is writing 2 Corinthians, he's pretty well worn out physically and emotionally and spiritually. So that's the context of this portion of 2 Corinthians that we're about to read. Now I'm going to start with chapter 4, which is queued up here, because it leads into chapter 5. He's writing about in the context of the experiences that I was just mentioning. So I'll read verse 7 there. We have this treasure. What treasure? The treasure of the gospel of the glory of God in Christ. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power of God belongs to God and not to us. What are the jars of clay? Our fragile physical bodies. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Paul was beaten nearly to death a number of times in his life through his work preaching the gospel around the ancient Roman world. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be also manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life is in you. Since we have the same spirit of faith according to what has been written, I believed, and so I spoke, we also believe, and we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. He's there speaking of the hope of Christ's coming in glory, at which time the faithful dead and the faithful living will be united as Christ comes. He will gather them to himself, all of them, all the faithful of all time. So let's go down to verse 17 here. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. For we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. If verse 17 looks familiar, as though it kind of rhymes with Romans 8, that is absolutely correct. This portion of 2 Corinthians was written probably October, November of 56, after an extremely hard and traumatic year in Paul's life. But he is determined around that time, he's coming into the consciousness that he can no longer preach the gospel anywhere without being recognized and people hounding him and trying to kill him. And so he decides to go to Jerusalem and present his case in Jerusalem as a kind of last act. Romans, he writes in the winter of 56-57, not long, maybe 6 weeks or 6 weeks after he writes 2 Corinthians, he writes Romans, or he begins writing on Romans when he's rested a little bit from all his traumas and stresses. And so what I'm saying is it's written at the same time, and he's got the same things in his mind when he writes both of these letters. So Romans 8 says, I consider the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. So he's thinking the same thing, that our sufferings in this current time are preparing us for the glory of God, the experience of the glory of God. So let's look now at 2 Corinthians 5. He says, For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. What is the tent of our earthly home? He's now speaking of the human body. This one that he's finding is, getting kind of threadbare. It's getting torn up and stressed. But if our body is torn down, he says, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. What is that building from God? I'm going to argue that it is the intimate presence of God that we think of when we think of heaven. This business of not made with hands, here is people talking about Jesus in Mark's gospel. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. So made with hands means created by human ingenuity and strength. Hebrews 9:11, when Christ appeared as the high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. And he says a few verses later in the same chapter, for Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. So the tent of witness, or the tabernacle, also known as the tent of meeting, that Moses was instructed to create according to certain specifications, and which in many ways Solomon copied many of those specifications when he created a temple made of stone. Those are both made with hands. They are made with human hands and human ingenuity, but they are not the true presence of God. They symbolize the full and intimate presence of God, like the Holy of Holies, where you have the cherubim who symbolize the place of God's throne, the place of God's full presence, power, and glory and intimacy, right? Those things are only symbols, earthly models to symbolize God's presence. It says in Hebrews 12, "You have not come to what may be touched," a physical mountain like Mount Sinai, "but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous made perfect, and to Jesus the mediator of a new covenant." So the Zion above, Zion is the holy city, and the city here down on earth is only symbolic of the place in heaven, which is where God resides in intimate communion with all the faithful of all time. Paul says something similar in Galatians 4, "The Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother." And in Revelation 7, which is a vision of what happens when Christ comes in glory, I believe, an angel says to John sees a multitude that was so large you couldn't count it. And they all had white robes and holding palm branches, and they were praising God and praising Jesus. And the angel said, "These are the ones who are coming out of the great tribulation. They've washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. They shall hunger no more, thirst no more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes." These themes of God's intimate, protective, and provident presence are reprised in chapter 21 in the context of the new creation at Christ's coming in glory. He says, "And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall be there mourning or crying or pain any more, for the former things have passed away.'" Now, the ESV translators here have said, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man." But actually, in the Greek, it is the tent of God. And actually, in the Greek language, you can use tent as a verb. You can use it as a verb in English, but it wouldn't be very normal, right? But in Greek, it's very normal, and also in the Hebrew of the Old Testament. To dwell in a tent is all one verb. And so he says, the tent of God is with humanity, and he will tent with them. So the true tent, the full, glorious, protective presence of God, will be with humanity on the earth when Jesus comes in glory. This is what is symbolized by the tent in the wilderness and by the temple, and what is symbolized by Mount Zion in this age will be fully manifested on the earth in the age to come. The New Jerusalem, which is the community of all the faithful of all time in intimate communion with God and under God's full presence and glory. So that is the tent, or that is the temple not made with hands. That is the true temple of God, the true city of God, and the true temple of God. Of course, in the 21st chapter of Revelation, John sees that the dimensions of the New Jerusalem that came down from heaven from God are cubic, and that it is gold all over, which is immediately evocative of the fact that the dimensions of the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, in the wilderness tabernacle, were 10 cubits by 10 cubits by 10 cubits. It was a cube. And also, The Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple is a cube. It has cubic dimensions. I don't recall if it's exactly the same size. It might be larger. But it is overlaid by gold on all surfaces. So what this is saying is that the New Jerusalem in the new creation will be the Holy of Holies, the entire community of faith on earth with God's full presence will be the true Holy of Holies, the place of God's full and intimate presence. Now let's look back at 2 Corinthians 5 in that context. We know that if the temple that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with man's, eternal in the heavens. He's talking about God's intimate presence. In this tent we groan, verse 2, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. We want to go and be in God's intimate presence. If, indeed, by putting it on, we might not be found naked. We don't, in this body and with God in heaven and us here on earth, we don't feel like we're fully clothed with God's glory and presence. We feel a yearning for a deeper connection with God that we can't have in this mortal life. There's something more for the life to come. Verse 4, for while we are in this tent, once again the body, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed. In other words, we don't want to lose our bodies, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. What life? The life of God's full and intimate presence. The Holy Spirit is the down payment of resurrection life. We get a down payment, a foretaste of the full presence of God in and through us that will be our experience in resurrection. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So God is preparing us in this life by giving us the Spirit and training us into the holiness that befits living in His full and intimate presence. He's working on preparing us. Sanctifying us is the old-fashioned word for that, right? God's Spirit sanctifies us to prepare us for full participation in the life of God. Verse 6, so we're always of good courage. We know that while we're at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. That's just life. I mean, that's the way it is, that we cannot in this mortal life, the way it's set up right now, be in God's full and unmediated presence. That is something we only achieve in the age to come. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, now we see in a glass dimly, but then face to face. For we walk, says Paul in verse 7, by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Paul understands that there's such a thing as being dead, but also being with Christ. Just as the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, says that all the faithful that have gone before us are in heaven, and they have been fully sanctified, and they are waiting for the resurrection there. We have hints of that also in the book of Revelation in chapter 6, in the fifth seal, where it says, the souls of those who had testified to God and to the truth in their mortal lives, but were killed for it, are under the altar. They are right there in God's presence. So Paul says, we are of good courage. We would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. He would prefer, as he said above, to come into God's full and glorious presence without losing his body. But if it was a choice between the two, he personally, because he has no enjoyment of being in this body. His ministry has taken him from one kind of pain to another, stress and heartache and persecution and threats of death. He's ready to be with his Lord, even if it means dying to go there. So, he says, verse 9, whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. So that's the portion. Let's now look at this. I'm going to go back to verse 1 here and look through it and see how well it works in one of the standard interpretations, which is that the home we are yearning for is our resurrection body. He says, "For if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God." Do we have our resurrection bodies now? No, we don't. We do have God's home in heaven now waiting for us. But our resurrection body does not now exist. It's not like there's a warehouse in heaven full of resurrection bodies hanging on hangers up there waiting for us. So that's not true, that our resurrection bodies is something we have. A house not made with hands. Well, of course, resurrection body is not made with hands, but then again, our current body is not made with hands either, so it's not a proper comparison. It is buildings that are houses made with hands, not our bodies. Eternal in the heavens, it says. Well, is our resurrection body eternal in the heavens? No, it has a beginning. God's presence is eternal in both directions. Our resurrection body, once we're given our resurrection bodies, then they will be incorruptible and will last forever. But they're not eternal in both directions, as the way God's home is, so to speak, right? And our resurrection bodies are not in the heavens, nor do they stay in the heavens forever when we receive them. They come to earth along with God in the new creation, and we live on this glorified earth in glorified bodies. That is what is promised in Revelation 21 and also in Romans 8 and Isaiah 66 for that matter. So nothing in verse 1 of chapter 5 here works with a resurrection body. It works perfectly if we understand that the house not made with hands is God's intimate full presence, which is now in heaven. Verse 2, "In this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling." Yeah, but in verse 4 it says, "While we are in this tent we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but we would be further clothed." No, that's not correct. I'm not yearning, I don't think anybody's yearning to put on their resurrection body over this mortal body. That doesn't make any sense. But to put on God's intimate presence as our clothing, that makes sense. So in verses 1 and 4, what Paul's saying is perfectly compatible with the idea that he's talking about our desire to be with God in those dwelling places that Jesus promised God has for us in his intimate presence. And it's not compatible in any way with the idea of a resurrection body. And then in verse 6 he says, "So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord." Well, that works perfectly with what I've been saying, that the dichotomy is between mortal life here on this earth and being in God's intimate presence in heaven, whether we have our bodies or not. But it doesn't really jibe with the idea that we're yearning for our resurrection bodies. Receiving a resurrection body is not the same thing as being at home with the Lord. Even the wicked will have resurrection bodies, but they will not be at home with the Lord. So that is my exegesis of 2 Corinthians 5, 1-9, and I invite your comments.